Good morning. Our story today is Not of This World, Jesus Before Pilate, and is found in John chapter 18:28 through chapter 19, verse 16, and Matthew 27:11-26. Pontius Pilate was flanked by his personal guards as he strode purposefully into the courtyard. Early morning light was just beginning to stream into the lush gardens of the opulent former residence of Herod the Great. Now the palace provided a luxurious refuge for Pilate whenever the circumstances demanded that he leave his more permanent residence in Caesarea Marineata, which overlooked the beautiful Mediterranean Sea. It was especially important that his presence was felt in Jerusalem during the times of the feast to keep the populace in check. His time as procurator over Judah had been tumultuous. He simply couldn't afford another riot. Rome was watching. Pilate sat down in an ornately carved chair that he had early ordered to be placed at the top of the short flight of steps leading to the courtyard. A small group of men, Jewish leaders, stood directly in front of him. The men, many of them were from the Jewish priesthood, had refused to enter his home for the meeting because they considered Gentiles' home unclean. Another man stood quietly in the center of the crowd, with his hands bound. The gathering had to wait only a moment for Pilate, but he had been ready for them. "What charges are you bringing against this man?" Pilate demanded. Pilate watched in satisfaction as his first blow hit home. He knew about the situation, of course. They had approached him the night before and obtained permission to use his soldiers for the arrest. As Pilate watched their flustered faces, his suspicions concerning their expectations of him were confirmed. They thought they could march into his courtyard with their prisoner, trial complete, sentence in place, and manipulate him to do their bidding. His insistence that they bring the charges formally had both surprised and unnerved them. He wasn't exactly sure why they were bringing one of their own to him, but the entire situation had a scent of opportunity to it. If they wanted something from him, he would gain something in return, and he would begin by showing them who was in charge. One of the men spoke up defensively. "If he were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate stared stonily back at him. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they protested. They couldn't, of course. They were important, a fact he would very much wanted them to remember. Pilate turned to his guards and motioned to them to bring the prisoner into the palace to be questioned separately. Then he stood down in the cool of the hall. Graceful columns rose from the intricate mosaic floor to support lofty arches high above him. A green glass platter laden with honeyed figs and plump grapes rested on a carved stone table near his right hand. Servants stood throughout the room, as silent and still as statues, waiting for his command. Pilate heard the approach of footsteps. He sat tall in his chair and adjusted the folds of his robe. The soldiers entered the room and led Jesus to stand before him. Silence blanketed the room as Pilate evaluated him. Jesus wore a simple, unadorned garment, the remnant of a common man. His eyes were bloodshot, and his face creased with exhaustion. Pilate realized the Jewish leaders must have gotten a bit carried away in their interrogations of him, because one cheek bore a red mark and had begun to swell. He did not seem to offer any struggle, and yet he was bound. This is it? This was the threat, the usurper king? Pilate laughed softly. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked incredulously. Jesus met Pilate's eyes unflinchingly. He refused to be drawn into his political maneuvering or petty insults. Instead, he appealed straight to the Roman leader's conscience. "Is that your own idea?" he asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" But Pilate's conscience was buried far beneath the stratum of his worldview. He could not conceive a king unrobed in humility and sacrifice any more than he could accept the Jews as anything other than despised people. "Am I a Jew?" he asked. The implication was clear. He couldn't possibly care about such things. Pilate narrowed his eyes and stared at the prisoner. There was something strange going on. Normally the Jews would do anything they could to cause trouble for him. Why were the leaders now bringing him one of their own? "Your own people and the chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Pilate asked. Pilate considered Jesus thoughtfully as he contemplated how the man before him could have gained such powerful enemies. Jesus looked at Pilate silently for a moment. The hour of his life was late. He did not have time for meaningless squabbles. Instead of answering the question, Jesus addressed the issue at the heart of the conflict. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now, my kingdom is from another place." "Oh, so you're a king then?" Pilate scoffed. "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." The Roman procurator's face darkened. Great philosophers loved to talk about universal truth, but as far as he had seen, there was no truth, not even in the most basic moments of life. It was unobtainable, like trying to grasp the motes of dust in the beams of sunlight that were now flooding through the windows on the hill. "What is truth?" he said cynically, and then with a brush of his hand, Pilate dismissed Jesus from the room. Pilate then rose to gaze out the window at the courtyard below him. A crowd had gathered behind the chief priests of their entourage. The people were assembling in anticipation of the traditional release of a prisoner in honor of Passover. Pilate knew Jesus was wildly popular among the commoners. He was certain some of those gathered had done so in hope of securing his release. Pilate glanced at the table beside the window and reached down to run his finger along the thin vein in the marble top, a hairline imperfection of potentially dangerous frailty. The people, too, had a dangerous flaw. They were divided, and Pilate fully intended to exploit it to his advantage. He would apply pressure to their own vain division, playing the desires of one against the other while lording his power over them all until he had the concessions he wanted. They would crumble like shattered marble around his feet. The chief priests had inadvertently surrendered a valuable pawn to him in their bloodlust to take the life of the Galilean prophet. He glanced back out the window with a satisfied smile and then walked briskly out of the room. A moment later, Pilate stepped into the bright morning sunlight. The crowd stilled at his approach. The Jewish leader stepped forward, importantly, expectantly, but Pilate ignored them and addressed the crowd behind him. "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it is your custom for me to release to you one of the prisoners at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews?" Immediately, the ego-bruised chief erupted in fury. "No, not him! Give us Barabbas!" Angry shouts mixed with cries for mercy in the courtyard for several moments as Pilate patiently allowed the cauldron of dissension to simmer. He raised his hands to silence the crowd and deliberately turned up the heat. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. The Jewish leaders had approached Pilate that morning with what seemed to be a perfect plan. Now a humiliating defeat was looking both inevitable and imminent, so they held nothing back. "Crucify him!" Shouts of protest erupted from Jesus' supporters as Pilate turned his back on them to enter the palace once again. As he turned, he motioned for the guard to come to him. "Yes, procurator?" "Scourge the prisoner and bring him back to me," Pilate ordered. Pilate retreated into the cool of the mansion to wait. A short while later, the guard entered. "The prisoner is ready, procurator." Excellent, Pilate replied. I will go out and speak to the people first. Bring him forth on my signal. Once again, a tense silence fell over the crowd at Pilate's approach. Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him, Pilate said. He held out his hand aloft, signaling to the guards to bring Jesus to stand in front of the crowd. Here is the man, he announced dramatically. Pilate turned to see the guards leading Jesus to the front of the platform. Trembling uncontrollably from pain and shock, he stumbled repeatedly as he struggled to walk. Pilate noted with satisfaction that this man had exceeded his expectations of them. All men emerged from the scourging post bloody, their flesh shredded and torn, but this prisoner had endured special humiliation. They had crowned him with thorns and placed a purple robe fit for a king on his lacerated back. The long thorns had pierced his scalp, and blood matted his hair and coursed down his face. The gasps and wails of horror of Jesus' followers were drowned out by the screams of them in power. These men, who had been entrusted with the spiritual leadership of a nation and honored with the task of recognizing and proclaiming Messiah's coming, now screamed for his tortured death. The kingdom of God had risen, but they were blinded to its coming. Crucify him! Crucify him! They chanted. Pilate pressed harder on the fault of their division, the fatal flaw of their misplaced desires. You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for charge against him, Pilate answered condescendingly. The Jewish leaders scrambled for a foothold as their powerlessness was flaunted before them once again. We have a law, they protested, and according to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. Pilate squinted at the glare of the Middle Eastern sun and then turned to look at the prisoner to his left. The Son of God? He motioned for the guards to follow with Jesus as he turned to walk back into the palace. He sat down in the hall and called for Jesus to be brought before him. Despite the heat, the man shivered and shook steadily as drops of blood fell on the mosaic floor beneath his feet. Where do you come from? Pilate asked him. But Jesus stared at the floor and said nothing. Pilate was enraged. He leaned forward in his seat and shouted, Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Do you not realize I have power either to free or crucify you? Slowly Jesus lifted his head to look at him. One eye was almost swollen shut, and his face was bloody and bruised. He looked steadily into Pilate's furious face for a long moment before speaking. You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin. The implication was clear. Power was a divine trust, and Pilate had violated that trust over and again through his abuse of his position. But similarly, the Jewish leaders had been entrusted with the power in both the judicial realm and the spiritual, and they had corrupted both to build and defend a kingdom of their own design. Pilate dismissed Jesus once again, and servants moved immediately to clean the floor where he stood. The procurator rose to absent-mindedly watch the crowd from the window again. Earlier, his wife had admonished him to have nothing to do with this man because of the dream she had previous night. He had always been taught that dreams were a message from the gods. Didn't this man say the kingdom was not of this world? Surely he had not scourged the Son of God. But no, it didn't make sense. What God would allow himself to be scourged? What God would submit willingly to the bonds of mere men? This man could not possibly be a king or God. Pilate shook his head free of the anxious thoughts and returned his attention to the crowd below. He could still win. He knew it. He walked back outside and quieted the crowd. I've decided to set him free. The Jewish leaders shouted back the best threat they could devise. "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar's. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Pilate was not afraid. They were moving even closer to his trap. Immediately, he called for Jesus to be brought to Gabbatha, the stone pavement. He was almost ready to pronounce judgment. He sat down and then turned to the Jewish leaders. "Here is your king," he said scornfully. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." They were almost there. Just another push. "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. "Victory!" Pilate sat back in his chair and smiled. They had sworn the allegiance they had been determined to never give. His instincts had been right. The Galilean prophet had been a very valuable pawn after all. There would be no more riots, no more dreaded council sent to Rome to report on all he'd been doing out of the emperor's sight. His rule was secure, but he wasn't quite finished ridiculing them yet. He stood and called for a golden bowl of water to be brought. Ceremoniously and with great pomp, he washed his hands, mocking the Jewish rite of atonement of an unsolved murder as outlined in the book of Deuteronomy. "I am innocent of this man's blood," Pilate said. "It is your responsibility." The message was sent and received. He wanted them to know he saw through their pious guise to their corrupt hearts and lustful for power. The chief priests steelly replied return without pause as Jesus' supporters began to weep. "His blood is on us and our children." Pilate laughed softly and shook the water from his hands and then motioned toward Jesus without looking at him. "Take him and crucify him." The Jewish leaders turned to go to their service at the temple. They had negotiated away their loyalty to the one true king in order to preserve their own position. Pilate returned to his palace to savor the thrill of winning a vital political battle. He gazed up at Herod the Great's lofty towers, the Phasael, the Mariam, the Hippicus. He was confident he would be enjoying Herod's many beautiful homes for a long time. Jesus returned to carry his cross-beam to Golgotha. He was just collateral damage in the eyes of Pilate and the Jewish leaders, a pawn to be played. In truth, his journey to the cross was the fulfillment of his kingly duty. It was a victory won. Each suffering step through Jerusalem street was graced with divine majesty. Every drop of sweat and blood was like a royal jewel strewn in the dust. It was a procession of majesty that the very angels of heaven paused in holy stillness and to watch it. His kingdom is not of this world. My king, the temporal, draws my flesh like the moon calls the tide. I am wooed by promises of power and am enamored with shining baubles that turn to ashes in my hand. Yet I want to be a loyal citizen of heaven. So give me the relentless vision for eternity and an unremitting delight for the kingdom that never fades. Thank you for listening and have a good day.